Now, at the same time, architecture. Architecture is becoming much more ornate. We call this Italianate architecture. Anytime you see these giant balustrades here and you see the sculptures up above, this is definitely Italianate. And the reason is the early Etruscans that came way, way before Christ was in the world, okay? The Etruscans used to put statues up above on their temples because that was the way you honored someone, was to put them up high. The Greeks used to put them up in the very tympanum in the top of their giant structures. This gave you this feeling of these people having a level of registry that we call grandness, you know. So they do that. Now, the Renaissance artists are bringing that back, but they're putting up like martyrs that have died for their belief in their Christian beliefs, or that have given their lives to the cause of Christianity. They are going to do it for saints. They are going to do it for anyone within the Christian kingdom that would be very important. And they're going to elevate those figures up above. So this is literally at St. Mark's, at San Marco, which is St. Mark's in Venice, Italy. And if you look here, you're going to have, there's a very large clock tower here, and then you have beautiful ornate structures here in the square. Now, just a note for those of you when you visit Venice, okay? When y'all are, because I know you'll all take a trip there. Do not sit down where those yellow chairs are and order coffee. $26 because they make you pay for the view. That's Italian, right? $26 for a cup of coffee to sit in the piazza. So keep in mind, always go inside and stand. All right, here we have Palladio. Now what Palladio's done that is so important is the same concept that was done, and this is before our course, but it would have been in the Roman times, and you would know it as the Pantheon. And the Pantheon is, again, a dome structure that was the largest spanned dome without an inner support. And so the Pantheon was basically Emperor Hadrian, okay? So I just want you to think of this dome structure, okay, that literally did not have anything supporting. And so what they did is they made the mix lighter as they got to the top so that it would stand. And this is the oldest building in the world of antiquity that is still in daily use today. And that's the Pantheon in Rome, okay? It spanned like 150 feet. But here's what Hadrian came up with. It was built on a circumference of this, okay? Lost to the world. That stopped. Even the Byzantines didn't do that when they came up with their great domes. It comes back during this time period, which is 1550 to 1570. So even in architecture, Renaissance is bringing back the great discoveries of the world, and they are starting to use these again. So we are moving into a time period of unbelievable progress. And that's why I said this is one of the most important time periods of, I believe, in art outside of the Greeks, and they're bringing it all back. So this is the idea, though, was this circumference. Now, who's going to be studying this in architecture is Michelangelo, and a lot of people never realize the architect that he was because they know him for sculpture, for the paintings at the Sistine Chapel, but they don't realize that he's also, he's going to be the architect for the Vatican. And the Vatican starts out as a very small basilica, but now it gets added onto, and it's Michelangelo's architecture designs that they will use for the dome of the Vatican, for everything there. Unfortunately, it won't be finished before he dies, and another architect will come in, but that architect is going to honor him and carry out what he'd done so that it's Michelangelo's design. And here's what he does. Again, the statues up all the way around, but you wouldn't believe the scale and size that you're going to see. So here was Palladios. Palladios, okay, is definitely in the round. Palladio is so famous that today when you go to build a house, if you want arch windows, just how many houses do you know with these arch windows, right? Do you know they're called Palladio windows to this day? That is the influence from this time, okay? All right, so moving on, you start to see these dome structures again, and now you see these churches expanding into these unbelievable cathedrals. Look at the light that comes into a church now, the difference in that. Those others were so dark, and now it's all about light streaming through into these churches. How's this for a ceiling? Isn't that gorgeous? This is Giacomo Vignola, and this is again in Rome. And look at the size then of these reclining figures. Do you see it? Do you know what that scale has to be if this is your height right here? How large are those figures? Because I don't think scale is never really, you never perceive the true scale unless you're there. But to see a figure on a ceiling that's 50 feet long, painted in proportion, now does that change your viewpoint? Mass and the impact that has, impact that has when you're looking at it. It's unbelievable. And like Emma, you've been in drawing and painting. How hard is it to get a figure in proportion?
You can do it when it's 50.
50 feet. Can you imagine 50 feet? It's just inconceivable, honestly. So anyway, there is basically dramatic. Now, hold on, because I go back in real quick. I say that. I wanted to go back up to the top, but I just wanted to. Mannerisms basically down at the bottom, so I have to kind of run through this presentation. All right, this was Veronese, and Veronese did Christ in the house of Levi. Remember I told you about the themes? This is the Last Supper, okay? But it was rejected. Now look, why was this rejected as a Last Supper? Turned out not really. Look at it and see what you see. Okay, y'all, with your notes? Okay. It's in linear perspective, beautifully done in linear perspective. If you've seen this, thought that this was Jesus in the Last Supper the first time you saw it? Do you really believe that's what the Last Supper was like? Doesn't this look like one huge party? And if you look carefully, you'll see little things like court jesters, and it really just became all about the court and these people, politically patrons, and their images being put into this painting, correct? And it's nothing like the true story of the Last Supper. So it was rejected. Veronese comes back, and you know what Veronese did? He changed it to Feast in the House of Levi, because that's where the Last Supper took place, was in Levi's house. And so he changed the title so that he could keep the painting. So is it that simple to get around something? Sometimes absolutely it is. Here you have Tintoretto. Now Tintoretto is one of the artists known for his great ability in foreshortening and dramatic effects. So look what Tintoretto does here. He puts the table on the diagonal. He pulls you straight to Christ here. We've got another feast going on, right? But look at it. It's with reverence. Why? Because look at your angels among you. Look at the light of the Holy Spirit. Look at the glow of Christ. It is all about Christ. But look, you got what? Chickens and mice and people. I mean, do you see this? However, if you'll look at the proportion to the figures and into the perspective, it works. And that's what I'm saying. Do you see now the difference in mannerism and the Renaissance works? Much more manneristic, isn't it? But would you have ever thought these are like Last Suppers? How about this? Look at the size of these figures. Do you see the size of this face? Do you see the scale of this leading you up here? Fall of the Giants. So, some of this I just want to get through. Abduction of the Sabine women. So, many times you'll see that, and many artists did this. They would do sculptures of this and paintings of this, but Sabine was basically overtaken in a wartime, and it's called Rape of Sabine Women. And it doesn't mean rape in the way you would know that as a term in our world today. It just meant that they literally went into the village and took their women, brought them back, married them, because they didn't have enough women. And this started to happen a lot during early times as well. So these are the depictions of that. Now, there is the reclining nude. So once Donatello does the statue of David in the nude, this opened the door. And now we're starting to see these reclining nude figures. But when we see these nudes, keep in mind, they are not representing biblical. That would not be appropriate. Here you have a salt cellar. Salt was a delicacy. It was very expensive and it was rare. And so the royals would have salt. It was so important that this would sit on their table just for salt. Can you imagine? Can you imagine your serving pieces being literally sculptures of that aptitude? I always laughed at this because of the portrait of these children, but now you start to see, though, we're getting into literally the portraiture, which is documenting families and who they are. And now you don't have to just be somebody of some importance. People are being documented because that is the time period. So we get into portraiture. Here you have Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time. Again, female figures, but not biblical. How about this? Parmigianino does Madonna with a long neck. Madonna we know is Mary, and this is Mary with child. That's Jesus. Look how elongated that figure is. How out of proportion, right? But do you see the dramatic effect that this has? I love this. Parmigianino's self-portrait in a mirror. Fall of the Rebel Angels, so that's St. Michael. And you're going to see a lot of paintings of heaven and hell right now too, because it's going to be stressed over and over again. And here is one of the most important paintings ever of all time. Have y'all seen this before? This is Titian, and he was a Venetian painter. And this is Venus of Urbino. This was the most scandalous painting. She's looking at her audience without her clothing on. What would you think of a woman like that in, what is the time? 1536. Imagine. Would a woman ever unclothe for a portrait? She's a countess, and she said that this was commissioned for her husband. But if you look at the painting and you look at the language, do you see the dog on the bed? And remember, what does the dog mean? Loyalty. So who's above the dog? the woman with the red skirt. So that's the one that's loyal, right? Now, what do you see in her hands? Actually, they're flowers, but they kind of look like grapes. Some would I would say flowers. What does that mean? It means her gentleman has just left. That's what it means. So it was the language of the painting. And a countess would never, ever look at her audience with her clothes removed. So it was scandalous, huge scandal. But here's the thing about art and the way art works in the language. To this day, if a woman is painted without her clothes on looking at her audience, the statement is that she's haughty. And haughty means that she thinks she's better than everyone else and she's held in disdain. So if she's somebody powerful that people don't like, then they would paint her or they would sculpt her in the nude staring at her audience. And we see this now carry on throughout time. You'll see language of art. You'll also see lamentation of Christ when he was taken down from the cross in the position that he was in. If a person is painted in that pose, it means they're innocent. So many people that were wrongly accused in the world, their portraits now are in that position to show their innocence. So art has a language all its own, but you would never know it if you didn't know the stories behind all of it. And people, this is why when art comes to the United States and becomes so popular at the turn of the century and the early 1900s, this is why it was important not to have censorship on art, but at the same time, the artist pulled away from the public and they quit doing art that was just to communicate with the public or to satisfy somebody who commissioned a piece of artwork that they had to do and that they had to fit within their rules and their regulations. Artists from Europe fled to the United States. They were so tired of being told exactly how to do something, whether it was rejected or allowed or not. They were being dictated by the church. They were being dictated by politics, by the elite wealthy. Everything was stifling them as artists. So they came to the United States. And in the United States, what happened? Freedom of speech. And because of freedom of speech, art grew, because artists were allowed to express themselves any way they wanted. But they'll use the language, believe me, they'll know the language and they will use it. And that's the thing in art history that you learn, is so much about these languages, okay? So I'm moving through some of this, but now you see these Titian's Pastoral Symphony. These are two female nudes while the men are clothed. Keep that in mind, because when we come along and we get into realism, the artist Manet, who's going to be the father of realism, is going to get kicked out of the Paris Salon because he is going to paint a painting that has this same content. And he's going to fight and say, I painted that because I am following a master and I'm using the content of a master. They still kick him out of the Paris Salon. The greatest artist of that time is kicked out for doing that. So do you know what happens next? The artists all come together and they rebel. And we start to have rebellious movements. Does anyone know what the rebel movement was that came about from that? From Manet being kicked out? French Impressionism. The artists started to paint the impression of what they saw. Impressionism. It was basically rebelling against. Here, Giorgione paints The Tempest. This is Mary with Christ, but it has to be titled The Tempest. And it was all about the attempt to progress and to paint these figures that they'd never been allowed to do. It was the fight for that, if you will. All right, now, I told you Michelangelo did the Vatican. This is the Vatican. This Vatican dome is similar to what dome that you've seen so far? Do you remember? Which dome was pointed, came up to the point? What was the greatest dome in Renaissance?
This chapel?
The Florence Cathedral.
Cathedral.
Do you remember the artist?
Michelangelo?
No, this Michelangelo does this one, but the artist,
Is it
yes,
Brunelleschi?
Brunelleschi. So who did Michelangelo copy? What was his influence? Brunelleschi. So that is the dome that he creates for the Vatican. The Vatican is the largest cathedral in the world. As a matter of fact, you can literally, the Vatican is 2 football fields long. From the front narthex to the end, 2 football fields. That's pretty big, isn't it? Not only that, the Vatican houses probably the largest art collection known in the world in their archives and in their museums. Probably the largest art collection. There's so much that some of it hasn't even been archived. So we're not completely aware of everything there. But if you look out here, you see this used to be an oval track that was a chariot racing track. And this track then was turned into the Palazzo area and then the church. And that is because who is buried beneath this? Do you remember?
Peter?
Mm-hmm. And they built the church over St. Peter's tomb. Now, do you see these statues up above I was talking about? What about all of these statues? So I've had students put their arms around these columns. It took 7 students holding hands. That's how big the base of those columns are. I said, you'll never get the scale unless you've been there. Has anyone been to the Vatican? Yeah? Were you blown away by the size of it?
Yeah, like just kept going.
So what was your favorite experience there? Can I ask you?
I really don't remember. There were just a lot of people. I didn't really to go inside, but I just saw the outside and I was like, this is massive. Like you look at it on TV and you're like, wow, this looks small, but then you see it like in real life, you're like, wow, this is so big, and it's just like the attention to detail with everything.
It's unreal. It's like that this ever existed and that people did this, you know. And it's sad that we don't have it in the world today, but there's no way we could, because economically that's not the way the world works anymore. I mean, there's just no way that we could do that. Okay, so here is part of what he did, and his design expanded out, and you can see that it's almost, to me, it's almost floral, but it's still on that concept of that central circular formation I was telling you about. So here we go. Then I wanted to come back through. You start to see a lot of like Bramante. They're all doing the domes now, the circular formations. So things are changing a little bit. This is Michelangelo's Pieta. Pieta, again, is Mary holding Christ after he's come down from the cross. This one is so famous because, is this the one that was during the World War II? I think this is one of the ones that Hitler had stolen, that they did get returned. So, but here is Michelangelo's great work. So, this is the Last Judgment. And I told you, after the schisms and after everything had happened, the church is now starting to reform and everything is changing, and there's this reformation going on. And this is leading us up, people, before we get to the Protestant movement, okay? So this is right before. All of the artists now are starting to, it's almost like hell and damnation. and they are going to be painting these scenes. So it's not just nativity, it's not the story of Christ in the Gospels anymore. Now it is about revelations. This is hell and damnation. This is what's gonna happen if you do not behave. And this is weight for your sins. So if you'll look here, it's a little bit humorous because this is Michelangelo's self-portrait. You see the melting blood? That's his self-portrait. But if you look here, this is Satan, and he's beating them and keeping them down in hell. So Michelangelo was pulled out of Florence, that he loved, and he was a sculptor, don't forget. He was pulled out of Florence, Italy, and demanded that he go to the Vatican and paint the wall of the Sistine Chapel. He had already painted the ceiling and spent like 3 years on the ceiling. Now he's called back to paint the wall, and he is told, like they all were, to do this last judgment, okay? So the portrait, the face that is on the figure is the face of the cardinal that pissed him off every day. Because this cardinal would come in and criticize and be critical. And Michelangelo was so tired of it, and so he literally painted that man's portrait on the face of the devil. When the Pope found out, the Pope says, it's a masterpiece from a master. It stays as it is. It stays as it is. So this is what I'm talking about. Artists, they had a sense of humor, and there were ways that they were able to implement themselves into their artworks, but he was not a proud man. He would have never painted himself as flesh if he'd been proud. He wasn't proud. And he was a very, very strong Catholic himself. Let's not forget, he was an under Cosimo de' Medici, and the de' Medicis had 4 popes. This is the family that Michelangelo served and lived with. So, you know, who better to do these works? But look at the scale of these figures, people. The size and scale. Now, this is another one that has that illusion that you're coming up through and that pulls the viewer up. And if you ever get a chance to see this, this is 48 feet by 44 feet. If you ever get a chance to see this, you've got to. You just have to. Here is Michelangelo's Sybil. Now, is that one buff woman or what? This is when, I mean, he did women as if they were men. I don't think he had a clue about women at all. Here is the fall of man. This is one of the details in the ceiling painting. Look at this Eve. Does that look female to you? Look at these figures, how Michelangelo did women. You'll never forget it. I mean, it's so funny. And not to just zone in, but people look at the breast. Come on. You know? So far off, yet he had perfect proportions. So this, you all know probably, the creation of Adam. And Michelangelo is one of the first to actually bring back a painting and to dare to paint God. That's what he did. So when you look at this, you see their reclining figures. You see this unbelievable proportion, this skill set. This is, 10 feet by almost 20, and that's just one panel in the ceiling up above. It's incredible. So it is making you, the audience, stand in under the creation of Adam. Very impressive. This is what the whole ceiling looks like in the Sistine Chapel. Now here's what gets me. Last time I was there, some of that fell off on the floor, which scares me to death. But what really gets to me is whenever they elect a new pope, the Sistine Chapel is where they all go, and they go through the whole election process there. And when they have elected a pope, they send up a smoke out of the Sistine Chapel to let all of Italy know. That smoke comes up out of there, and that lets Italy know that the Pope has been selected. So they're literally smoking that building out. It's, and I'm like, with these works, so crazy. All right, Michelangelo then does the tomb of Giuliani, the de Medici, some say Medici, some say Medici. So, do you see what I'm talking about, a female body? Nobody's breast would ever be that far apart. He just didn't know. But the saddest thing about Michelangelo was, he was such a great sculptor, and he was commissioned to do these works for all of these tombs, and then when he died, his was nothing. As a matter of fact, his cousin went to Rome and got his body and brought it back to Florence, Italy, because that's where his love was Florence. And he did not want to be in Rome and have to do all of these things. So he went there and got the body and snuck it out and brought it back. Now it is in Florence, Italy. So, and yes, now it does have works around it. This is Bound Slave. The reason this one is so important is because I think I mentioned to you that when he was working on the Sistine ceiling, he would go out into the garden every day at the Vatican, and there was a statue of a bound slave that had been done by early Greek artists. Michelangelo knew that that statue was above anything that he'd seen, and so he would draw it. And he had all these drawings of the statue, and he was asked, why do you draw this all the time? And he said, because if it was done in the world, then it can be done again, but I have to study it. And so he had like thousands of drawings of that. And here you see then what he was trying to accomplish. Do you see emotion? Do you see movement in the body? Do you see that proportion? Yes, he did do it, and he did it better than much of the Greeks. This is the statue of Moses. The world has changed, and it's so much better now on these things, but what you don't realize is when I was much younger in art history, I searched all over Rome for this statue. I knew it was in Rome, but not where. And nobody, it used to be like a treasure hunt to find things, and it wasn't always written about or put in a textbook or somewhere you could find it. And I could not find Moses, and I looked everywhere. And I was sitting at a restaurant one day behind the Colosseum, and I'll never forget it. And I was talking to the waiter, and I was like, yeah, I'm over here with students, we're on a tour, we're doing this. And I said, but on this trip, I said, I just hope that I get to find the statue of Moses. And he goes, you haven't been in to see it? And I said, no, I've looked everywhere and I don't know which church it's in. And he laughed and he said, it's right behind you. Right behind me. People, it was in the university church. The university was there behind me. I had no idea. And I went in there, and you know what else was in there? If you've ever heard the stories about the chains breaking when Paul was in prison, those chains are there in a glass case. And the statue of Moses. Couldn't believe it. But do you remember when I showed you Pisano in the very beginning and he put the horns on the head? And we said they were rays of light? See? Michelangelo does the horns. And it almost would make you think that it was Satan, because that's our culture. But those are representing literally these rays of light. That's the way it works. And here is the great statue of David. So, another personal story. There is a professor here at Glenn that was a graduate student when I used to teach at Sol Ross. And he went on a European trip with us as a graduate assistant. And he'd done a lot of sculpture. He teaches the ceramics here. And he went into the academy and saw the statue of David. And he was blown away by it. I mean, it's unbelievable when you're actually there in front of David and you see it. And I found him in the gift shop afterward, and I said, what do you think? And he was like, I can't get over it. And he said, I'm never going to be able to do that. And I was like, no, you won't. And he's never let me live it down, because a teacher never says that to a student, y'all. That is the worst thing you can say. And I was like, no, you won't. And he, to this day, will not let me live that down, because he was like, you squelched all of my abilities. That moment, you took it away from me. So anyway, David is in exact perfect proportion except for his hands. Now, remember in the beginning when we talked about principles and elements. So one of the principles is dominance. And when an artist makes something larger, they do it intentionally to show you that that has the most importance. That's why we call it dominance. Not only is it larger scale, but it has a dominant purpose behind it. So why are the hands larger? They're the hands of God. They're not Michelangelo's hands. And that was the language of art. So Michelangelo did that. The other thing he did is look at the face of David. This is David before he takes down the giant. All of the other artists did David as a war hero after he took down the giant. And you see David with the head of Goliath, and you see David and all these other forms. But Michelangelo did him before. Why?
Show his faith.
And with true faith, total true faith, be that calm. I mean, he's about to go up against a giant that even armies haven't been able to take down. And he's that calm. He's 17 years old. And he's standing there to take down a giant. And he has that calm. Now, does that show faith? Better than many words could ever say, doesn't it? So that's why the language of Michelangelo's work is so profound and so important. It was the way that he could express that into the artwork. And it showed other artists to use your art as a language to express things, to speak within the artwork. And that is why I said, you learn to read paintings, you learn the past of these paintings, you learn the history of these sculptures, and then you know when you see these stances and this body language, and when you see these symbols, you know that there's speech in this. And I promise you, people have written dissertations on one work of art. Do you know how long a dissertation is? On one work of art. Did you realize that one piece of artwork could say that much? We just don't get the depth of what the artwork truly is. This is the Pieta that is in the Vatican. And as you walk into the Vatican, she sits over to the right. She is behind bulletproof glass because at one time it was attacked just like the David was. And someone came up with a hammer and beat the sculpture. And so they've done what they can to repair it, but it was in the foot. If you'll look here, and I think her finger possibly, but if you look here, you see this slumped figure of Christ. Do you see that? Now, if you look, there is a sash that is across Mary's chest. So one day Michelangelo was there and someone had asked who had done the sculpture. And whoever was there at the Vatican at the time mentioned some other artist. Michelangelo went and got his chisels, came back and wrote his name on the sash. After he did it, it was in stone. After he did it, he said that it was a terrible act of pride and that it desecrates artwork. And so to this day, true artists that follow the forms of art are very, very careful never to put their name boldly in the artwork unless they're documenting it and it makes a major statement. But they know, and that is why an artist's signature is very small down in a corner somewhere on a painting, or very small at the base of a sculpture, because the artwork should speak for itself and you should never desecrate the artwork. If you see an artwork and the name is boldly in front of you, that means that that person is doing that artwork as a way of immortalizing themselves. It'll be your last statement in the world, because your art will live far longer than human life will be, and artists know that. And many artists will leave a work behind in the world that is a statement piece of their work. Then they would do that. But Michelangelo did it out of an act of pride. After that, then artists honor that. Now, the body slump. This is the figure I'm talking about. Whenever you see an artwork in that form, it is telling you the person's innocent. Well, this is important when we get into revolutions and political warfares and things that will happen, because you'll see many times the artist will use that language. To this day, there are contemporary paintings right now that use this language. So whenever you see the body in that form, you know that means innocence. It was also ridiculed because, do you look at the face of Mary? How old would you think Mary is?
Really young.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe 16 to 20, right? How old was Mary when Christ passed away?
45.
Yeah.
maybe.
Exactly. So again, is Michelangelo using his own language to speak? And he was saying that she was ageless, that she was timeless. And he was more portraying her at the age she was when the angel came to her and told her that she would have the Christ child. It's a whole statement, deeper than we think, okay? So that's really what I wanted you to see out of some of this. This is Baldassare Castiglione, and I want you to see this because the wet eye treatment I told you from Da Vinci, you can see the realism that now is starting to happen, but look at these sleeves. What fabric would you say that is? Velvet? Okay. Textures, are you kidding? Would you look at the ability to paint the textures? So as we move from Mannerism and Renaissance, we're going to move into a next era called Baroque. And during the Baroque era, the artists are going to understand that they can do an awful lot with a brush stroke and even leave some of their brush strokes. They don't have to smooth all their brush strokes out. They can even leave them, and they're going to start to imply things, but they're going to be at the height of mastery in creating these textures. So in art, there are many studies that you go through. You go through still life, you go through learning to paint glass, you're going to learn to paint brass, you're going to learn flesh tones, painting flesh, you will learn textures. When you learn all of these concepts, do you think you can do a fantastic painting that looks almost like a photograph? Yeah, because they're skills, and they're just skills that you learn. Once you have those, you can do that. But does that give your artwork language? What do you think is the hardest thing to learn in art? It's to speak without using the words. It's to tell a story through body language, through iconography symbols, through dominance of hands. And it is you telling your story. Does the audience have to understand your story? No, because it becomes about the artist and the freedom to tell your story any way you want. But that's what they got to. Okay, so again, this is Pope Leo X with the cardinals. Again, Giulio de' Medici, always de' Medicis, and Rossi. They're incredible. But here is the one, the ninja we love, is Raphael, right? So Raphael does School of Athens. What Raphael is doing is he's now using history to portray his language, and he's speaking within the artwork. This is also there at Vatican City. But if you'll look, this is Aristotle and Plato. Who are they? Great philosophers. But this is the portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. Right here. Now, if you had a geometric shape in an artwork right to the middle of it, we know that that would be a target, would it not? But it's okay to be a target when the artist is telling you something. So clearly, the artist is saying something about this person. What do you think they're saying? They're honoring this person as the greatest of importance. When people go to give an acceptance speech, what do? Don't they first thank everyone? You know, I want to say thank you to these people that made this happen. That's what the artist did. But who were they thanking? If that's Da Vinci's portrait, whose portrait is this? That's Michelangelo. Now, Raphael went further. Are you ready? If you'll look right here, whose portrait is that? That's Raphael. So he was honoring the greats. The greats weren't Aristotle and Plato. That was the commission. Who were the greats to him? Da Vinci, Michelangelo. And instead of patrons being in the painting, the elite and wealthy that paid for it, he put the masters in there. And it was a way of honoring them. In his work, he learned from them. So they were important to his work. Here you have Del Sarto, Madonna of the Harpies. I love this because it's so much more realistic image. Do you see the dramatic, though, manneristic effect of this? So now can you see mannerism? What do y'all know about mannerism? Now, can you tell it? At all? Can you see a difference in the work? Mannerism has this dramatic, do you really think that's the right scale and size of her knee to her foot? No, but it's dramatic effect, is it not? Or his? Is that a his or a her? I'm not sure. But then, it's all the dramatic effect, so that it is pulling the viewer in and taking you up through. They've even placed an angel with the rainbow wings, which is a seraphim, at the feet of Mary. That is placing her on the pedestal, is it not, literally? And that is putting seraphim at her feet, which seraphim crown guard the throne of God. Now, here's Raphael, Madonna in the meadow. You see the flowers again, I told you, the symbolisms, but I know this in the background has great meaning. I just don't know where it is, but I know he was painting a location on purpose. This is the Christ child, and he always has to be placed above this one. And who would this be then?
John the Baptist.
So one of Da Vinci's works, there are two paintings that are very similar. And people said, why do you paint it twice? One of them was rejected because he actually put John the Baptist higher than the Christ child. And that's the story that goes with it. I'm not so sure that's accurate. And the reason I'm not is because the backgrounds are different on the paintings. And I think you're talking one of the greatest genius of all times. Don't you think he's saying something in his work? If the language is this strong with the artist, he's got to be. And because a third painting, just like it, was found in Scotland, in a castle. And they went back and they looked. And a young man from Scotland was going to school in Italy and purchased the painting while he was in Italy. So, there's got to be more to the stories. All right, remember me telling you about the red and blues? And again, back to the Da Vinci's. These are my favorites, and these are called the cartoons. And I love when they work out the whole schematic here with the lights and darks and everything. This is an underpainting before they paint it. And today they go in and they are able to x-ray many of these paintings. It's like MRI imaging. And they're able to see what the artist was drawing in under it and how they changed their mind and what they added to it later and what they did. This one had the finger, see that? Pointing up to heaven. This, with the two fingers, do you remember what that was?
Is it like a sign of blessing?
Mm-hmm. It was the Jewish one though. Jewish sign of blessing, remember? The head of a Jewish clan could pass down a sign of blessing to the eldest son. All right, so here is Madonna of the Rocks. That'd be a great name for a drink, right? Madonna on the Rocks. Okay, see the hand? And do you see here? So see the finger that is pointing upward? This is the one that they felt like was accurate. They're pointing to Jesus, see that? And then that finger's pointing up. Now, if you look in the background, you have the grotto. Well, the truth is, do you know what the manger was, people? A lot of people think that it was like a wood shack. It wasn't. It was like a cave entrance. So maybe he's being historically accurate. I don't know. But look at this background. Okay. This was the big painting I showed you of the Last Judgment earlier, and I don't know why they put it out there. But here you have Vatican City. So it's important to know that Vatican City, again, was moved away from Rome. It was out there. It was originally on top of St. Peter's tomb, but Vatican City is its own government. It's like Washington, D.C. It's its own government. It is not part of Rome. It is across the Tiber River, and it is its own government. So that is Mannerism. That is Renaissance. Now, the beginning of this course, we're on Renaissance a long time, aren't we? So you see the impact of Renaissance? All right, now we're going to move into the end of it, which means we're going to be looking at definitely progressed artworks, but you're going to see the content change a lot. It's not just going to be the religious content. Because as we cross over, we'll get into Baroque, and there's still going to be some of that religion coming through during the Baroque, but we're going to start to phase out of all of the religious works. The religious works were extremely important because of what? Why was this so powerful at the time?
They couldn't read, so it was like how people learned.
Absolutely, absolutely. And who was paying for it? Who were the wealthy and elite after Black Death?
The church.
The church and people in the church, they were the patrons. No, it is the patrons, but most of the patrons were connected to the church, were they not? So they're the ones paying for cathedrals to be built. They're the ones that are paying for these chapels. They're paying the artists. They're doing all of this, right? So as we move along into the Baroque era, things change completely. And that's when we'll move into the Protestant movement. Now, the Protestant movement is going to be when Martin Luther, who is a Catholic priest, stands up and he says, no. What is he going to say no to that's going to start the whole Protestant movement?
I'm trying to sell salvation.
Yeah.
But didn't it happen in 1517?
What?
Martin Luther?
Yeah, it
Oh.
starts then, but when we go into Baroque, that's what it's going to be about.
How is like, I guess we'll talk about it then.
No, go
I was
ahead.
gonna say, like, how does like the patrons, I guess, like, did them paying for it, is that kind of like a kickstart of like indulgences, do you think? Of, like,
Oh, it was totally the indulgences because
Is it,
they're the
like,
ones
paid
that
for
were given it.
salvation?
The artist wasn't given it that did the artwork.
Yeah.
It was the people that paid for the art. When I showed you School of Athens, Raphael didn't get to sign his signature. So he had to put his own self-portrait in there as his signature. Today, there are many artworks that they can't tell you if it's really a Da Vinci or not, or if that would be someone else's. Why? Artists weren't even allowed to sign their works. That's why when Michelangelo signed that statue, that was pretty big and pretty bold, because they didn't own their works. They were basically paid employees. under contract, which is very interesting because you go from that and these artists are trying to find their freedom to do artwork, okay? And that's what's gonna be so huge going into the Baroque era is for the very first time, artists are gonna put their works in a gallery that they decide to do, that no one made them do or told them what to do. And they're gonna start selling artworks out of a gallery, and academies are gonna open art schools for the very first time. Instead of having to be paid for by some wealthy family and placed under a master to work, they're literally going to have academies that they will start, okay? But before then, artists were owned. They were under this contract. Now, here's the funny thing. We get to a time period in the world where we have designers. Now, what does a designer do for a living? They go to work for a company and they design, right? When you go to the bathroom, do you stop and think that that toilet, was it a designer came up with that style or that model? But during the Industrial Revolution, they had to hire designers because they were mass producing things, correct? Do you stop to think that there's a designer that does that bicycle, the style of it, or the car, or a faucet, or we don't even think of them as artists, do we? But are they not? Did they not have to have all the education and the degrees so that they could do these things and they are designers? But here's the thing, do you ever see a signature on your faucet? Or a dishwasher? And somebody may come up with the motor, but who do you think does the packaging and the style and all this other? What about in clothing? Do you remember for a while, y'all might remember this, for a while in clothing, the designers started putting their names like, I don't know, if you bought Calvin Klein, it was like Calvin. Do you remember this? Do you know what they were doing? It was almost a rebellion so that they were stating it was theirs. Because here's what happens when a designer is hired by a company. They sign a contract. That means anything they create, who owns it? Every single sketch that you would do, Kevin, in your sketchbook, if you were under contract,
They own it.
they own it. That means when you leave that job, do they have the rights to everything you ever created in that time period?
Everything.
And if you ever go out and you publish what you've done, they get the royalties because you were under contract. Now, is that right, in your opinion?
If it's on the contract, then I guess.
So how are we any different today than what we just learned?
It's not.
We're not.
Like it's strange. Like I think you said starting with this country, like the inception of this country, like it was the first time that you create without any fear of any kind of persecution. But me, I feel like if you say the wrong thing, you get canceled.
And and think about, y'all, you've seen this with music. Haven't you seen this with musicians? And they have the rights to their songs. You see this all the time. Why does the artist not have the right to it?
Because it can like spark change, and society is afraid of change, really.
Exactly. Yeah, I do think so. But I also think that it's greed. I think it's a greed situation.
Yeah.
And what I think is really so sad about that is that
The people who are on top of
they're
just trying to
making
stay
the
on.
money off of that.
Yeah.
But then we have laws like copyright, okay? But people just kind of ignore copyright. It's like they don't realize. How many people through the years do you think I have seen draw Superman or Mickey Mouse? Are those your images? No. Those belong to that artist. Are they under copyright? And I'm really proud of Disney because Disney is one of the only ones that they'll go after them. They see those images, they'll sue them. And you would not believe the lawyers that work for Disney and how many people have been sued for creating the Disney images. Now, when you're a child, you're doing it innocently. It's something you see all the time, but that goes before a court. A court has a way of working out whether you're stealing the artist's image or not. A child's not stealing that image, you know? And when you're learning to draw, you're not. But do you see the delicacy of these things and why these things are so important? And then you take into account censorship. Really? Censorship. So people go in and destroy your artwork because they don't like the message. Now, is that fair? Remove it if it offends, by all means. I'm totally behind removing an image that offends somebody. Absolutely. If it's offensive, but do you destroy it? No, you never destroy someone's work, not in my opinion. It's like books being burned. Do you really burn them?
It's the
Seriously?
same thing. Like if you say, oh, you can't show this, you can't show this, or you can't talk about that. It's the same thing as that. Like it happens every day.
But
like,
it's history. And when you wipe out history, what are you doing?
the people, like
And whether we like the history or not, is it not history?
it's yeah, it's our story. It's a part of our story, and you try to make people shut up about telling like their side of the story is like you know.
Do we all have the
Scary.
right to express ourselves in our own artwork? I believe we do. And I believe that I see why the artists had languages. I see why they had secret stories and why they had to use things to speak. I believe that. But on the other end, as a humanitarian, I'm a huge humanitarian. So on the other end, I've traveled the world and been through so many third world countries and so many cultures, and I will tell you this. If someone is offended, yes, do something about it. Be kind. Just be kind, you know? But I don't believe in destruction. I don't. I think that's going way back to the iconoclast.
I think people are afraid of freedom of speech really because it's like, yeah, it's kind of like a two-edged sword. It's like, yeah, that people need to express themselves, but at the same time, it's some people, you know, that have some things to say, like when that time in when Trump was tweeting and stuff, as all the folks was inside the Capitol, and then these folks just shut off his account, you know, like his Twitter account, because some people like freedom of speech. It sounds good, but like you know,
What does it do?
the truth is
exactly.
there are
What
people.
can that create?
Yeah, there are people in this world, you know.
It's true. And these are ethical questions, but in art history, it is not about the ethics because we don't get into ethics, but in art history, it's just about the creation of artworks and how they are a historical record.
The human experience, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so next class, I'm going to finish up and I will review you for the exam. And I want to ask you real quick before you leave while I have you, I've got 3 minutes. I want to ask you, I didn't like the idea of opening your exam